Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to speak to Bill C-65, an important bill dealing with harassment in the federal workplace. Now, it's important to understand that this bill did not come out when it did by pure coincidence. And I'm going to recount some of the incidents and things that happened around when this bill came out for context. So, Mr. Speaker, all members of the House will, I'm sure, remember that the Me Too movement touched a wide segment of society around the world last autumn. Then in January, just before the House sat, we had a number of revelations within Canadian political circles as well. One of them did affect the Liberal government. Allegations about misconduct about a decade ago by the honourable member for Calgary Centre were made known. At that time, he was the member of Sport and Persons with Disabilities, but that did not continue because he was asked to leave the cabinet and a secret investigation was launched later. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't recite these facts to be disrespectful or rude at all to the honourable member. This is important context which helps to explain the Prime Minister's many quotable statements from this narrow window of time. For example, as news of the former minister's past actions were being reported, the Prime Minister, then at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, said, and I quote, "We must each have a well-understood, established process in place to file allegations of workplace harassment. And when we receive those complaints, we must take them seriously. As women speak up, it is our responsibility to listen and, more importantly, to believe them." End quote. Those were the Prime Minister's words. That's quite clear the government's policy as well. Now, it's not just the words of the Prime Minister's speech, but establishing a complaints process, including in our own offices on Parliament Hill, is very much at the heart of Bill C-65. Upon his return to Canada, the Prime Minister said days later to the CBC, and again I quote, "The Prime Minister said the standard applies to everyone. There is no context in which someone doesn't have responsibility for things they have done in the past." End quote. So, now, Madam Speaker, it is quite clear. As I mentioned earlier, a wave of revelations and probing questions was sweeping Parliament Hill that week. That's why it's not at all surprising that the CBC would, in that same interview with the Prime Minister, quiz the Prime Minister about his own past. And when quizzed and asked, the Prime Minister answered, and I quote, "I've been very, very careful all my life to be thoughtful, to be respectful of people's space and people's headspace as well." End quote. So, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister laid down the law about sexual harassment and misconduct allegations when he stated that we should always, 1, believe complaints, 2, hear out retrospective complaints without time limit, 3, apply one standard to all, and 4, don't worry, just know he's squeaky clean, apparently. With respect to the final point, Madam Speaker, it turns out that there were actual previous allegations of impropriety made against the Prime Minister that surfaced when late this spring copies of the Creston Valley Advance from August 2000 surfaced. An editorial penned by a reporter on staff informed readers, and I'm going to read, quoting at this point. "I'm sorry. If I'd known you were reporting for a national paper, I never would have been so forward." These were the words that were spoken to an advance reporter by the son of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, August 4th. He, the now Prime Minister, was in Creston to celebrate the Kokanee Summit Festival put on by the Columbia Brewery, apologized a day late for inappropriately handling the reporter while she was on assignment, not only for the Advance, but also for the National Post and Vancouver Sun. Shouldn't the son of a former Prime Minister be aware of the rights and wrongs that go along with public socializing? Didn't he learn through his vast experience in public life that groping a strange young woman isn't in the handbook of proper etiquette, regardless of who she is, what her business is, or where they are? End quote of that article. Groped, Madam Speaker. Her words, not mine. So applying the edict from the Prime Minister, I assume we are to believe her story that she was groped by the Prime Minister, disregard the date, no matter how far back the complaint went, and apply the same standard which applies to the honourable member for Nunavut, Calgary Centre and Calgary Skyview, which was removed from Cabinet and or the Liberal caucus. Right? Well, members will remember that didn't quite turn out as you would have expected based on the Prime Minister's own rules. Mind you, part of the problem was that the Canadian media paid virtually no attention to the Prime Minister's groping allegations. If only they would have given just a fraction of the coverage to this issue happening here in Canada as they did to the Kavanaugh story happening in the United States. But that is wishful thinking. Despite that, Madam Speaker, back in July, the Prime Minister went on record defending his groping by saying, and I quote, "I had a good day. I don't remember any negative interaction at all. I'm confident I did not act inappropriately, but part of this awakening that we're having as society is that it's not just one side of the story that matters. It's the same interaction can be experienced very differently from one person to the next." And then the Prime Minister went on to say, often a man experiences an interaction as being benign or not appropriate. And a woman, particularly in a professional context, can experience it differently, and we have to respect that and reflect on that. Unquote. So, Madam Speaker, to boil this all down, a simple phrase sums up the Prime Minister's words and deeds here. Do as I say and not as I do. You know what? That catchphrase seems to describe a lot of what we see from this Liberal government. I'm afraid it's playing itself out yet again in the area of sexual misconduct. The Prime Minister, when he took the stage in Davos, said that having an established policy was crucial. His own government's legislation, which we're debating today, will entrench this expectation in federal labour law. However, we don't know what policies apply to the Prime Minister himself. Earlier this autumn, I put some written questions on the order paper to get answers. Here's what I'm asking. What is the procedure when there is an accusation against the Prime Minister, including who decides if a complaint has merits and warrants an investigation? Who conducts the investigation? Does the individual conducting the investigation have the ability to recommend sanctions? Are the recommendation sanctions binding? What's the policy regarding whether or not the reports and findings are released to the public? What mechanism, if any, exists for the temporary suspension of certain duties of the Prime Minister pending the outcome of the investigation? And does the procedure apply to incidents which occur prior to the individual becoming Prime Minister? Those, Madam Speaker, are my questions. They are valid questions. Canadians deserve to know, this Parliament deserves to know, how the Prime Minister will be held accountable if there are past allegations of sexual misconduct. I have not had an answer back yet. Now, I would have thought that for something so near and dear to the Prime Minister's heart, that they would actually have this already prepared and they would have given me an answer immediately. Again, wishful thinking. But there is a deadline to respond to my questions, so we should know come mid-November just what procedures are in place for Canada's Prime Minister. Maybe they'll even comply with what they expect of other Canadians in Bill C-65. This assumes naturally that the government actually answers the question, assuming there is actually a policy. And assuming, of course, that Bill C-65 is not simply another case of Liberals do as I say but not as I do. So in closing, Madam Speaker, Canada's Conservatives support this bill as combating harassment. It is a pressing need in all sectors of society, including the Parliament of Canada. We believe that all forms of harassment, sexual violence and discrimination are unacceptable. That's why at committee, among other things, we as Conservatives successfully introduced an amendment to avoid political interference in political offices during harassment investigations. We also successfully introduced amendments to ensure strict timelines for investigations into incidents of harassment to ensure investigations are carried out in a timely manner. Madam Speaker, I think we can all agree in this place that government policy needs to focus on supporting victims of harassment. This bill is a positive step in that direction. We do look forward to answers from the Prime Minister's office in regards to the policies that are in place should there be allegations against the Prime Minister himself. And Madam Speaker, we support the bill. We do want more answers. We expect more answers. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm glad that the Conservatives Party is supporting the bill. It doesn't surprise me. We have heard that in second reading and third reading. We've seen support from all sides of this House in recognizing that this is indeed a historic type of legislation that ensures that we're going to have more harmony in the workforce going forward. It demonstrates strong national leadership. And I would encourage my colleagues across the way in particular that they seem to want to take into those personal attacks on whatever type of legislation comes before us. And when we look at the legislation we have today, recognize the many different stakeholders that are out there, not only elected or in the Senate chambers, but Canadians as a whole, that recognizes the bill for what it is, and that is a solid piece of legislation that advances our society in a very positive way. My question to my colleague across the way, would she not agree that not only should the national government continue to demonstrate leadership on this file, but it's also important that we see things such as our provincial entities that also have labour laws to reflect on this type of legislation and look at ways in which they can provide a better, more harmony in our workforce?
The Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for that question. I will quickly answer his question. I think we need to get our own house in order here before we start telling other jurisdictions how to handle issues that they may or may not facing, which leads me to the point that I was making in my speech, and I would like to present this to my honourable colleague in the position that he is in. Will we be able to get answers regarding how the allegations of sexual misconduct are handled when they are against the Prime Minister? Again, we've seen these allegations happen over the summer. The Prime Minister did not address them directly. In fact, he said that men and women experience things differently. And Madam Speaker, that actually goes to the very heart of what we are saying. No, that's actually an excuse. I can't be abusive or hurt somebody and then say that they might have experienced differently, and then it lets me off the hook. That's why we have this legislation in place. That's why we all support it. But what we don't know and what we haven't seen is what is the process for the Prime Minister himself. Now, we know what happens when ministers, when there are accusations that are levied against ministers. They've been removed from Cabinet. They've indeed been removed from the Liberal caucus. And, Madam Speaker, we didn't know what that investigation looked like. Canadians deserve to know how investigations will be handled if there's an allegation against the Prime Minister.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Opposition House Leader for her speech. And I'm glad that all of us here seem to be supporting this bill. It's a step forward in the right direction in how we work, what the culture of work is like here, or what the environment is like, both here in this place and across the country. So I'm happy to hear that. And she talked a lot about, incidents in the past. I'm just wondering if she might have some further comments about how things will change in the future for people that work in government here, and how, well, specific concerns that I have around things like privacy. How, we live in a small bubble here. We work in a small bubble. How privacy of complainants might be protected in the future.
The Official Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for that question as well. And he is very correct. I think this is an issue that, with technology, with behavior, we're learning more, we're growing as a society, that this is an issue that will be changing. I know, Madam Speaker, we supported that this will be looked at every 5 years, that there will be a review, so that we can ensure that we are using best practices to ensure that we live in a harassment-free workplace, that our employees, that the people that we interact with day to day are supported and are able to reach their fullest potential. So we do support seeing this reviewed every 5 years and being able to change and evolve as the situation changes. Thank you.
Resuming debate, reprise